A new book is shaking the very foundations of thought on the causes of poverty and underachievement. It strikes home particularly hard in America, where group ethnic and racial identity are strong. In The Economics and Politics of Race, Dr. Thomas Sowell says that Chinese, Jews, and Japanese are overachievers, and blacks, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans are underachievers. And it's all due to culture. I'm Tony Brown. In a moment, the ethnic flaw. You identified human capital in your book, and you say, now you tell me if I'm not paraphrasing you correctly, you say the Chinese succeed because they outwork everyone else.
Oh, yes.
Is it that simple?
In a sense, yes. That if you put in enormous amounts of work, you're going to have a tremendous advantage over people who don't.
The Economics and Politics of Race. Dr. Sowell, you have written what I consider to be one of the most exhaustive statements I have ever seen on an awfully complex subject. I'm really not sure that I understand it that thoroughly, so let me begin by trying to get some general understanding. Are you saying that in a culturally pluralistic society such as America, are you saying that the variable in success or lack of success is the culture of the particular group?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And I'm saying it not only for the United States, but in terms of the studies of various other countries around the world, the same thing seems to be true. You not only find the same group having the same characteristics in country after the country. That is, the Germans produced the first pianos in Australia. They created the piano industry in the United States. They built the first pianos in England. They built the first pianos in Russia. You look at the Chinese, what they major in Malaysia in college is what they major in the United States in college.
Namely science and chemistry.
Science and technology, heavily. And this follows the group around the world. So the notion that the group is a creature of society, that society has shaped the group, just will not stand up to the facts.
If you say that culture is the variable in success, which means conversely, culture is the variable in failure, and you cite the phenomenal achievement of West Indians, which is the largest black immigrant group in the United States.
Yes.
Their phenomenal success in the United States, I think they earn about, second generation earns about 15% more average
than the average American.
Than the average American. But they don't do well in their own native countries, and they don't do well in England. Now, if culture is the variable, why is that a fact?
I guess you'd have a selective migration coming into this. That's also true of other groups, by the way. The Chinese are prosperous everywhere in the world except China. The Indians are prosperous throughout Africa, but they are in terrible shape in India. They are prosperous in Malaysia. They are prosperous in other parts of Burma at one time. There are many groups which, when freed from the constraints of their particular society, burst forth with all the other abilities that they have. In their own homes, they're throttled by various other factors.
Now, you also delineate the migration of the African from Africa through the Caribbean, if that took place, and then into the United States. And you distinguish and you document the difference in the form of slavery that took place in the West Indies and the form of slavery that took place in the United States, and you relate that to the performance of the two respective groups.
Yes. In the light of what you've said, though, and in the light of the recent studies of England, you can't push that too far because, in fact, in the West Indies, the Chinese are disproportionately the entrepreneurs. But of the West Indians who come to the United States, you have a very heavy selection factor going on. You have that with most immigrant groups, by the way.
What do you mean selection factor?
That is, the average person of the average country doesn't get up and leave and go to some other country. It's the person who is unusual. It's not in ability, at least in attitudes and other kinds of things like that. That's also common around the world. When people go into, let's think of the Japanese who come to the United States, the Chinese who come to the United States. They do better than the Chinese who were born in the United States. Whites who come to the United States do better than whites who were born in the United States.
Isn't that true of all immigrants as compared to native-born Americans?
Yes, and compared to people of the same ethnic background. So that's true in Canada and in Britain. White immigrants to Canada do better than white Canadians. White immigrants to Britain do better than white Britons. So you have a very heavy selection factor going on.
Okay, now after we've all settled here for a generation or two, and we are all what we call America, which is a culturally pluralistic society, different cultures living side by side, we then have kind of shaken all that immigrant edge off, haven't we?
Not really, not really. Because second and third generation, well, second generation West Indians, as you point out, keep on going up the ladder. These things last varying amounts of time. Sometimes they last for centuries. You have groups, for example, like the Germans who settled in Russia. They settled there for 100 years. They left Russia the same people they were when they came there. Many of them still didn't speak Russian. They continued the German that they'd already had. The habits were completely German. And they came to the United States, they were completely German. And they settled out in the far west, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and so on, and have a pattern of life that came straight out of Germany as if they had never been in Russia.
Well, what is it in American life today? You cite 6 groups in 2 categories. You cite Jews, Chinese, and Japanese as overachieving groups. You cite blacks, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans as underachieving groups. Now, what are you describing there? What have you identified there as a variable?
Oh, income. Well, the achievement is measured in terms of income and occupation. That is economic achievement. Obviously, there are other kinds of things that make up life. But, and I wouldn't want to stigmatize groups as permanently underachievers. If you look at generation by generation, you find incredible changes. The black population especially. The change in occupations of blacks between the 1920s and the 1950s is just phenomenal. So that what we're watching are people who, for cultural reasons and historical reasons, begin behind a certain level and have not closed the gap. It's like a relay race. You don't say that the runner is a bad runner because he hasn't closed the gap when he started 50 yards behind. If he's 40 yards behind now, we don't call him a failure. We say he's made up 10 yards.
Well, I'm sure you do know the conventional wisdom in America is that every immigrant group to this country, with the exception of blacks, has closed the gap.
That's not really true. It depends upon what time frame you're talking about and how you define the groups. The Chinese who've come here from Hong Kong and other parts of China since the Second World War are in dire poverty in many parts of Chinatowns of New York, of San Francisco, Los Angeles, in many cases far worse off than the average black. So that isn't true that every group has done this. Blacks started much further behind. I don't think people realize how much further behind blacks started and how much progress has been made. There's a distinguished economic historian, Robert Higgs, who has said that for blacks to go from being completely illiterate in the middle of the 19th century to being 1/2 literate and by 1900 is just an amazing achievement in the history of the world, that you very seldom find that kind of change that quickly. So it depends on what you're holding as your standard.
The standard is that blacks haven't caught up with whites.
Whites haven't stood still.
You make another point in terms of intra-black relations, and that is, you say, affirmative action for the most part has really benefited blacks who really didn't need affirmative action.
Affirmative action is a great way for black PhDs to get endowed chairs. It's a terrible way for some kid in the South Bronx to try to get his first job. What affirmative action does is create an incentive for people to hire those who have a proven track record, those who have degrees and things like that. It makes it more dangerous for the employer to hire an untrained person with no track record, because if he has to fire that person, then he's letting himself in for legal trouble. Whereas you can hire a white of very doubtful qualifications, and if he doesn't work out, throw him out in the street the next week. You hire blacks of doubtful qualifications and throw them out in the street the next week, and you've got the NAACP, you've got the EEOC, you've got God knows who all to contend with. The employers have long ago figured this one out, and so they have not hired those blacks who are at all doubtful, either in terms of qualifications or simply not enough experience to know how good they are. You see this in the data. Blacks who have education and who have experience have been moving up on whites, and in some cases overtaking whites. If you look at blacks who have not finished high school, blacks who come from background of families that are broken and so forth, they are falling further and further behind, not only further behind the population in general, but further behind whites with the same disadvantages.
What do you blame for that? You're not blaming middle-class blacks who are beneficiaries of affirmative action, are you?
I'm blaming the incentives created by affirmative action, because when it comes to the incentives that are created, the businessman is going to try to protect himself whatever way he can, and that means hiring those blacks who are overqualified, who have a long track record and so on. And that's what all the data show, that the more, for example, black couples where the husband and wife are both college educated now make more money than white couples where the husband and wife are both educated. But the black female-headed family has lost real income in absolute terms over the past several years and has fallen further behind white female-headed families. So the very opposite trends are going on at the same time, and you can't argue this because of blackness or racism, because both of them are black people. One group is shooting way ahead, one is falling further and further behind. And a large part of that reason, I believe, and the data seem to suggest, is because the incentives created by affirmative action and similar kinds of programs just make it too dangerous to take a chance.
Now let's go back a little to culture as a variable. Let's attempt, if you would, for me, delineate the difference in the impact of culture on West Indian blacks as compared to Native American blacks in terms of performance.
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand you, but I guess what I see is that in terms of performance, let's say in the school systems, studies were done ages ago showing black West Indian kids doing better than black American kids in the public schools, where they both sat side by side. This, again, is not unusual. The same thing has been found if you look at Mexican and Japanese kids sitting side by side in California, that the Japanese kids will score 20 points higher on the IQ, which is the same as that between blacks and whites in segregated schools. So that whether you're sitting together or apart doesn't seem to make very much difference. What matters is what kind of attitudes you take into the school system and how you make use of whatever's done there. Unfortunately, in so many of the school systems where blacks are today, in ghettos particularly, the education offered is so terrible that there's not an awful lot that can be done.
Now, you have gone around the world and looked at groups of varying backgrounds. We now have an influx of another wave of influx of immigrants, particularly from the East. Many of these groups are settling in black neighborhoods and going into business and so forth, and there is now some friction and a lot of debate about that phenomenon. What is it in their culture that you see that relates to their entrepreneurial performance now?
Well, what I could do is say that this is true of these same groups throughout Southeast Asia. It's true in Guyana, in Panama, in Peru, in Jamaica. That the Chinese have been entrepreneurial in all these areas for centuries on end. For example, in much of Southeast Asia, the Chinese own over half of all the rice mills in the country, even though the Chinese are only about 5% of the population of these countries. It's true of other groups, the Germans in Russia under the Tsars. At one time, all the members of the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences in Russia were Germans, even though the Germans were only 1% of the Russian population. So this is not an unusual thing, and it's particularly not unusual for the Chinese.
Well, tell me, what groups are coming here as a result of the chaos in the East, in particular?
Well, from Vietnam, the boat people, 70% of the boat people were Chinese. And one of the reasons it was so hard to settle them in the Far East was they were hated. The groups, wherever there are groups that have skills that are lacking in the larger society, from an economic point of view, they're very valuable to that society. From a political point of view, they are invariably hated. This is true of the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Jews in Europe, the Indians in East Africa, the Igbos in Nigeria. You run through the whole list, it's exactly the same kind of reaction.
But are you saying there's something in the black culture that prohibits them from doing what these Chinese boat people do when they come from Vietnam?
No. What I'm saying, I look at it entirely differently. I don't ask what is the cause of poverty. Everybody is born poor and ignorant. The question is, what factors allow some groups to get from that position? Blacks, first of all, started further back and are coming forward. And at this point, there simply has not been the pattern of entrepreneurship in the black population. That's been true of other groups, such as the Irish, for example. The Irish are doing quite well today, but they're not doing well in entrepreneurial occupations. They're in the law, they're in the church, they're in this, they're in that. And on the bottom line is they're doing better than the average American, but they're not doing it in those particular fields. Every group succeeds in some particular area. Blacks who win Nobel Prizes don't win them in the same fields that the Chinese win Nobel Prizes in.
You identified human capital in your book, and you say, now you tell me if I'm not paraphrasing you correctly, you say the Chinese succeed because they outwork everyone else.
Oh, yes.
Is it that simple?
In a sense, yes. That if you put in enormous amounts of work, you're going to have a tremendous advantage over people who don't. A study was done in San Francisco schools to show Asians, blacks, whites, Hispanics, and how they score in various fields, and mathematics in particular. And there were vast differences, for example, between the Asians and blacks in terms of how many got high math grades. What struck me was that for both the Asians and the Africans, the number of hours that you spent working or doing homework in math was almost identical with the same percentage who got high grades in math. So that whether you're black or Chinese, if you spend an awful lot of time on the math, you're going to be doing better than the person who's not. And although there were great disparities, the disparities were differences in how much time you spend on math homework.
Well, then conversely, Dr. Sowell, are you not saying that groups who do not overachieve are groups who don't work hard enough?
Sometimes, but sometimes the government itself makes it impossible or very difficult for groups to work hard enough. The minimum wage law is one classic example. Occupational licensing laws are another. Insofar as the school system fails, those groups that don't have an independent educational tradition are lost. Whereas if you have that independent tradition, even if you go to a bad school, if the parents can help you, if you get the maximum that you possibly can from the books and so on, you still may achieve quite a lot. So it's a combination. It is the culture, but at the same time, insofar as a society puts barriers, particularly the government, which has tremendous power, and supplies education and other kinds of things, insofar as they do that, they make it tougher for you to do it.
Well, do you suspect that you may be guilty of de-emphasizing the effects of racism in that pattern?
There's always, everything is a possibility. But as I look at the data, I don't find any correlation between the degree of racism and the degree to which groups advance. That is, if you look at the history of the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the hostility they have encountered there will compare with any hostility blacks have encountered here. There have been a number of occasions in the history of Southeast Asia where the number of Chinese killed in a few days exceeded all the blacks lynched in the history of the United States. So they are enormously hated.
What about Jews?
The Jews, of course, the same thing has happened with the Jews numerous times. Thousands killed here, thousands killed there. And of course, under the Nazis, millions killed. The groups, incidentally, which have suffered the most violence, and I use that as one index of group hostility or racism, those groups have typically been middleman minorities. The Chinese, the Jews, the Armenians, the Igbos in Nigeria, 30,000 of those were killed in massacres just within our time. And yet I don't find any correlation in the long run between the economics and the political hostility.
All right, let's get back to the primary criticism of your book made by a writer I really respect, William Raspberry, syndicated columnist. He says that you make these points, but you don't say what we should do.
What we should first of all do is understand what does and does not work. I don't consider myself to be a policymaker, despite what the media may try to say. I consider myself to be someone who tries to supply facts so that those who do make policy will know what they're talking about, as they usually do not.
Now, speaking of what the media says, you have stopped giving interviews for the last couple of years.
Yes, I should have stopped many years before that, actually.
Why do you say that?
I see no correlation between what I say and what the media reports. One of the most hideous things that I've seen reported was on the CBS Morning News, where they said or suggested that I was a believer in the theory of genetic inferiority of blacks. Now, I have been arguing against that theory for more than 10 years, and I don't know how many books, how many articles, and how many lectures. This was so well known that British television tried to arrange a debate between Arthur Jensen and me. I don't know why the word got to London, but it never got to Washington.
So you have been wary, to say the least, of the media.
I think that's an understatement.
Speaking of your book, is there something that you definitively found that you did not suspect before you did your research in terms of group achievement or the lack of group achievement, as can be applied to a multiracial society such as the United States?
One of the things that surprised me was how little correlation there was between acculturation and achievement.
Would you define that for us?
But that is taking on the culture of the surrounding society. That the Chinese, for example, in Southeast Asia, in many cases will live for generations there, maintaining their own culture, their own language. The Germans have done this in Russia and various parts of South America, other parts of the world. And yet, when we look at groups like Hispanics, those Hispanics who don't learn English are far behind those Hispanics who do in terms of incomes and occupations. And what I finally got out of all of that was that if you're working for someone else, then you must know the culture of that society. If you're able to set up your own farms, your own businesses, be in independent professions, it doesn't really matter that much. But if you have to go out and work for someone else, then you must know his language, you must know how his culture operates in order for you to operate in it.
What else did you find out about the Hispanic culture?
That it was not like the culture, for example, of the Germans, that in Hispanic countries, various other groups such as Germans in Latin America have disproportionately contributed to the industrialization of these countries. The British have done so also. That in a number of countries of Latin America, the Germans, the British, other groups like that, actually dominate many of the industrial enterprises of those countries. It also argues against the case of what society does. Clearly in a Hispanic society, there is not discrimination against Hispanics. And so therefore you cannot explain why Jews, Germans, and other groups, Japanese in parts of Latin America, have done better than the native Hispanic peoples of those countries.
In terms of education of blacks in the United States, you point out that over 50% of the PhDs awarded to blacks is in education. And you don't seem to think much of a PhD in education.
It's not a question of what I think, it's a question of what the marketplace thinks. And there's not much money in that. So if you're going to compare blacks and whites who have PhDs, you have to realize you're talking about apples and oranges. If you're going to compare blacks and Asians with PhDs, you're really talking about apples and oranges, since the Asian PhDs will be disproportionately in math, science, technology, and fields like that. So that I think that's a rational choice to some extent. Insofar as people have not had the same educational background, they must do what they can do, not what they would like to do. What's encouraging to me is that second-generation blacks in college, that is, blacks whose parents went to college before them, are majoring in mathematical and other such areas to almost exactly the same extent as the general society. So again, as you break these numbers down, there is a sign of progress, but there's very little sign of any kind of miracle taking place.
What do you mean miracle?
That is, there are people who will talk in terms of what the proportion of blacks are who earn so much or are represented in various occupations. You're not going to be an engineer unless you've got an engineering degree. And if blacks' degrees are in education, then we don't expect to find blacks represented in engineering in proportion to blacks in the society.
So that's an example in which our cultural choice determines our income, and our income is partly due to the income gap between blacks and whites. Is that part of it?
Yes, yes. But that's true not only with blacks and whites, it's true right across the board. The difference between Asians and Hispanics, for example, at the PhD level and earlier, is slightly greater than that between blacks and Asians, or certainly greater than that between blacks and whites. So the black-white difference that we're always comparing is not at all unique. The income difference between Japanese Americans and Puerto Ricans is higher than that between blacks and whites. And yet if you explain the black-white difference in terms of the unique history of blacks, you're left out on a limb wondering, well, then why then do the Japanese exceed the Puerto Ricans by so much when their history is absolutely different from either of those two groups?
Now you point out that the third world is larger than the first world, the Western world, and the second world, the communist bloc, combined.
Yes.
But you don't feel that there's much cohesion there or much probability of it working as a unit?
No, no. One of the reasons that they're poor is because of the lack of cohesion. That if you spend your time fighting each other instead of working things out, you can't expect to do as well as people who work things out. Now, unfortunately, in the West, many of the working things out has meant that the strong have conquered the weak.
What about the role of politics in the economic future of blacks in this country?
Again, I would draw upon the experience of other countries and other groups. I can't think of a single group anywhere in the world that has risen from poverty to affluence through politics. There are any number of groups that have risen from poverty to affluence through almost every other conceivable means. When I look at the groups that have had spectacular rises, like the Jews or the Chinese, they are almost invariably groups that stayed away from politics. And they usually stayed away until after they became affluent. Some of them could then afford to go into politics. But that was not the mechanism by which they got where they are.
What was the mechanism?
Basically work, skills, saving.
Now you're saying then that the train in the black community in terms of voter registration and political power, political empowerment, is on the wrong track.
I think that if what you expect out of that is economic advancement for the mass of black people, now if all that you're looking for is some advancement on the part of the leaders, or if what you're looking for is something like what happened in the Civil Rights Revolution, where you needed to get the Southern Jim Crow system broken, that was an enormous achievement through politics, as I point out in the book. So it's not that politics can't do anything. It's a question that politics, like everything else, has some things it can do and some things it can't do. And from what I've seen of groups around the world economically, one of the things it seems not to be able to do is raise groups from poverty to affluence.
Well, who controls the society? Those that are in the political control or those in economic control?
Those with economic skills tend to advance, whether they have any political power or not. And those without those skills tend not to advance, even when they have great political power.
But what about dominating a society? Do you dominate a society through politics, or do you dominate it through economics?
Depends on how you define it. But in Malaysia, for example, the Malays have overwhelming political domination of their society, and they use it ruthlessly against the Chinese minority. The Chinese still make double the income of the Malays on the average.
You make a statement in your book, Dr. Sowell, and I would like to quote, "Discrimination has been pervasive, but not pervasively effective."
Yes.
What does that mean?
It means that people have discriminated against other people wherever they've had the power to do it, almost everywhere in the world and almost every period of history. Some groups are kept back by this, and some groups, it seems to make no difference whatever. Insofar, for example, as you have entrepreneurial skills, the fact that people didn't hire Jews in the 19th century didn't stop Jews from hiring each other and setting up and dominating industries such as the garment industry or the beginning of the great Hollywood movie studios and other areas of the economy. It is the skills that are crucial, and not the fact that other people are willing or unwilling to hire you. Even groups that have a great animosity towards other groups will nevertheless hire members of those groups with skills in the long run if there are enough of them to make it worth their while.
What's the lesson in that statement for black Americans?
Skills are what matters. If other people will not acknowledge your skills in the short run, then those same skills are useful in the black community with other blacks. It's what has made other groups advance from poverty to affluence. I know of nothing else that's really done it. Skills and, of course, the work and the savings.
For a transcript, send $2 to Tony Brown Productions, 1501 Broadway, Suite 2014, New York, New York 10036. Please include program topic and allow 3 weeks for delivery. Tony Brown Productions produces this program and is solely responsible for its content.